Greetings, everybody, and welcome along to a French edition of our regular streams. We are, of course, joining you today live from Perfidious Albion, and it is 39 minutes past 7, starting 6 minutes early, and it is the 6th of September 2024. And today we are here to discuss a certain Monsieur Macron and his latest scam. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with what has been going on in France, there has been a long period now, over a month in fact, where the French government, nominally at least, has been without a leader. Now, of course, Macron is head of state, and also the French president plays a very important role in the government, whereas some heads of state, some presidents do not. The French president has an awful lot of power under the system established in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. Now, let's dive a little bit back into history to just discover why. The Fifth Republic dates from 1958, and it is the, of course, successor to the ill-fated Fourth Republic. Now, the Fourth Republic ended in what was essentially a military coup, though nobody likes to talk about that. It's, in fact, one of the most successfully covered up events in recent European history that should be much better known than it is. In 1958, the French ruling class, facing a gigantic crisis in Algeria, where they were losing a war, and facing defeat at the hands of the National Liberation Front in Algeria, having already been humiliated and driven out of Vietnam, they were facing a disaster in that what they regarded as a part of France, l'Algérie française, as they used to say, was breaking away and looking like it was going to go its own way, which ultimately it did. And this provoked a crisis because there was this mentality in not just the French ruling class, but it had been instilled in an awful lot of the French petty bourgeoisie, especially those who'd become settlers in Algeria, that they were literally just going to another part of France. Of course, this wasn't true. The Algerians were certainly not treated even on the same level as French proletarians. And this is why, of course, a war of national liberation began, a war which was exceedingly brutal and which saw over 1 million Algerians die in the decade-long fight for independence. But by 1958, it is all going exceedingly pear-shaped for them. So there is talk of a negotiated settlement with the FLN. There is talk and amongst the settlers in Algeria, who were known as the Pieds Noirs, or Blackfeet for some reason, that they were going to get sold out. The French military, particularly its most rabid, imperialist, pro-fascist elements, were determined that they weren't going to allow the government of the Fourth Republic, which had been formed after the liberation of France in 1945. They weren't going to allow the civilian government to, as they would say, sell out the settlers. So what did they do? Well, they staged a military uprising in Algeria, creating a crisis. The government of the Fourth Republic resigned, and de Gaulle was asked by his old military comrades to form a government. De Gaulle agreed, having departed from the scene, I believe in 1946, because he wasn't allowed to run things in the way he saw fit. He agreed to return to French politics only on the grounds that he would be able to essentially write the constitution himself, along with it, rewrite it in a way he saw fit, to give tremendous power to the office of the French president in a way that it didn't have under the constitution of the Fourth Republic, and to essentially allow him to act almost as an absolute monarch, which is how he and his allies saw the necessary measures could be taken as they saw it. Now, herein we, of course, have a certain similarity with what is going on today. The complaints coming from the French ruling class about France today are that it is becoming ungovernable, that Macron has failed to clamp down upon working class resistance, that they need a new way forward. Well, in 1958, their new way forward came in the form of a coup, which destroyed the constitution of the Fourth Republic and ushered de Gaulle into power with the powers of a semi-monarch almost. Now, back then, I believe I'm right in saying that the original term of the French president was for 7 years. So this was an extraordinarily powerful office that was created during the military coup of 1958. And de Gaulle, of course, served for over a decade in that office. And the powers of the French president, of course, have remained extensive, even though they've taken the election period now down. So it's only once every 5 years the French president is elected, rather than once every 7. But the powers of the office remain extensive. However, those powers can be limited or stymied somewhat if a French president isn't able to command a majority in the French National Assembly, which Macron now cannot, and also that he has to what they would call cohabit with a prime minister from an opposition party. Now, in reality, these are all bourgeois parties, so they find a way to get along to pursue the ruling class's agenda. But it does create more rows. I remember back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of toing and froing between Jacques Chirac and the former Trotskyite Lionel Jospin of the Parti Socialiste, who was elected as prime minister, I believe, in 1998. So this cohabitation, as they call it, can create problems. So to rewind back time just to a few months ago, you had Macron call early parliamentary elections back in July with the specific aim to try and reassert his authority, because this his new party, which is essentially cobbled together elements that left the party Macron used to be a member of, which is the old Parti Socialiste, which is still around, led by disgusting criminals like Francois Hollande. And the results, of course, went against him, went decisively against him. So now, in the 577 strong National Assembly in France, you have a Macron's coalition, but then you have an assemblage of other parties against him. So you have the heirs to the Front National, which is the Rassemblement National, which is led by Le Pen. You then have the Nouveau Front Populaire, which is the cobbled together elements between the LFI, which is Mélenchon, the Socialists, which is Hollande, or they're led by various other characters, all of whom have the same reactionary nature. I think the leader now is Glucksmann, who's a pure character of like what you would call the Washington Consensus. Very much a pro-imperialist, rabidly in favor of the war on Ukraine, rabidly in favor of just about every military expedition that the French imperialists have ever engaged in. That's your socialist leader. You also then have the Greens and various others who are all about the same. So Macron, point here is, can't actually command a majority in the parliament. So the combined forces of the government can muster only come to 213 on pure arithmetic. The opposition have 364, meaning the NFP, the left, did have the right to put forward a candidate for prime minister. They did. Macron, of course, said no, as he can do under the constitution. So the way in which we have reached this, shall we say, dissolution of Macron's power, which is essentially what this is that his prime minister, Gabriel Attal, resigned. Macron initially refused to accept his resignation. Eventually he had to. And now you have Michel Barnier coming out from a party in the form of the old Republicans, the sort of heirs to the Gaullist or the Gaullist legacy, but they are, of course, a much diminished presence. It's the party that, or the assemblage of parties that you counted Chirac amongst its numbers, and most of the former Gaullist presidents of France. That's now diminished down to less than 50 seats. They're sort of lashed up with Macron's Together for the Republic group, as it's called. And Barnier comes from this now small right-wing or liberal conservative, I would say, mainly just liberal party that is a minority within the coalition that Macron has cobbled together. So why Barnier is the question. And you look at Barnier's background, you can sort of see why. What is Barnier there to do? Now, Barnier has been around for a long time. He's 73. He's been in government service since the early 1970s in one form or another. He was trained at one of the elite French, essentially finishing schools for their public sector, for their civil service and politicians. So he comes from very much the governing elite of France. His grandfather and his great-grandfather were both very senior officers, both generals in the French armed forces. So this is who Barnier is. Very establishment figure, very much seen as a safe pair of hands by the ruling class. If you look at the coverage of this in like the Financial Times is always the one to turn to when you're looking for the opinion of the British ruling class. They're kind of reassured by Barnier's presence, but still unsure as to which way things are going to go in France. The big concern that comes from French bourgeois sources and their equivalents in Britain, their big concern, as the FT expresses, is that France has become ungovernable. And they're very worried about that. Now, why is that? They're worried about that because they've been trying over many years now to erode and destroy the fighting abilities, the fighting spirit of the French working class. They've been trying to do it for years. They've been eroding slowly the concessions that were made once to the French working class for many decades now. This was a process that actually began over 40 years ago with the wretched scumbag Mitterrand, who was elected on a sort of radical reformist ticket, then immediately, after about a year in office, did a reverse ferret and started enacting counter-reforms after the French ruling class staged a market panic and threatened capital flight. So this is a process that's been going on over 40 years, but the resistance carries on, slowing down what the French ruling class and their press say are necessary reforms, meaning a tax on the pension system, which Macron has been trying to carry out, the increased taxation on the working class and indeed the middle class, continuing monopolization of the land, meaning a tax on small and medium French farmers, who of course are a militant bunch. When things don't go their way, they tend to raise a stink, quite literally in the case of the French, as they are fond of spraying manure on the various municipal buildings which contain politicians who have offended them. So the ruling class in France have been desperately trying to break the resistance of the French working class to be able to carry through what they regard as their Thatcher moment. They're obsessed with this. A lot of European countries, Western European countries, which didn't have quite the same level of defeat that inflicted upon the working class as was inflicted here, they're all obsessed with getting themselves a Thatcher moment. I don't think any of them really understand the Thatcher period, to be honest, because the Thatcher period, in the minds of her fans, in the various bourgeois parties across Europe, was like an uninterrupted stream of victories that the great Thatcher masterminded. In reality, it was a lot different. Thatcher was able to inflict the defeat upon the working class that she did, largely because of treachery within the working class movement itself, largely through the collaboration of the trade union leaders, through the buying off of significant sections of the working class through the 1980s, through partially through things like council house sales, but also by managing to stop the working class unifying by making a lot of concessions to certain elements within the working class in the 1980s, so they could focus on destroying the resistance of the most militant sections. And in this, they were joined happily by the trade union leaders and the Labour Party. So the process by which the ruling class here won their victories in the 80s is a lot more complicated than the fanboys of Thatcher would have you believe. And they couldn't have done it without the active assistance of the trade union leaders and the collaboration of certain elements in the working class. And that was all possible because there was still enough juice left in British capitalism in order that the ruling class could afford to make concessions when they needed to do something in terms of breaking the resistance of the most militant sections. They could afford to make a few concessions to people like those who worked in the power industry, making sure that they were well paid enough that they didn't walk out on strike and get the lights switched off. The public sector in the 1980s actually continued to expand in certain areas. So if you could actually get a decent public sector job back in the 1980s. And so there were various different concessions that were made to guarantee that they won their big battle. The idiots in charge in France just think it was a case of like charging headlong into the working class and sticking the boot in, which of course the French police are always willing to do. Point being that the French ruling class have been casting about looking for their hero, looking for their new Bonaparte perhaps, in order that the resistance of the working class can be broken and they can restore profitability internally by shredding pensions, slashing wages, delivering a wholesale and successful attack upon the French workers. This has increased in its urgency. They need to do this more than ever now, because of course now they're faced with a crisis inside the neo-colonial empire that Charles de Gaulle built and people like Mitterrand defended. They're being forced out of places like Mali, Niger, Chad, even Burkina Faso especially. They're facing the nationalization of uranium mining, of gold mining. They're facing these former French colonies coming together to defend themselves against the imperialists, but also the imperialist proxy forces in the form of the supposed jihadists in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So this is a big problem that the French ruling class have, and it's only getting worse. And they, as I said, they've been looking for the new Bonaparte, maybe via Thatcher, for years now. They thought it would be Chirac, and that ultimately didn't deliver them what they needed. Chirac was faced with huge resistance from the French working class in the mid-90s, and it basically led to the destruction of the government of Alain Juppé, who was his prime minister at the time. And they then thought they'd found their man in the form of Sarkozy, this sort of corrupt hack. He, of course, was a key part in making war on Libya and destroying the Libyan government led by Gaddafi and destroying that country. It didn't do him any favors. He ultimately lost the next election to the arch loser, Francois Hollande. And again, he didn't really achieve what the ruling class wanted. So they make a turn away from the traditional parties. They try to essentially create a populist-looking party, but one which would be ruled over by a guy like Macron, who's like a pure product of the French governmental system, but who will spout like various populist-sounding messages if he feels the need. So that's what the Macron party, Together for the Republic, actually consists of. It's like built up using populist language, but in order to deliver solidly pro-capitalist, pro-capitalist so-called reforms or counter-reforms, if you will. And he attempts, this is why Macron behaves in such an aggressive manner, because French imperialism is facing a great crisis. So it tries to attack the working class in various different ways, runs into a lot of opposition, ultimately gets bogged down in the war in Ukraine, which he, of course, the French ruling class, of course, back, because they share the objective of the US ruling class and the British, that the government headed by Vladimir Putin should be destroyed and Russia should be reduced to the status of a neo-colony. That's an objective the French ruling class share with the British and with the Americans and with the Germans. Now, they all disagree about how the best way, what the best way is to go about this, but they are all agreed on the objective. And it was very foolish of the Russians if they ever believed that the French and the Germans would ever deal honestly with them. They would not. These are imperialist powers just as much as the British are. And the United States, of course, being head of this particular vile collection. But Macron ultimately fails, gets bogged down in a war that they can't win in Ukraine, loses the neo-colonial possessions or the neo-colonial system in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, comes under threat as well in Chad. Everything starts falling apart. So then Macron takes a gamble, thinks he can pull off some kind of shock result, ultimately loses the election. Le Pen doesn't quite get the majority she needs to form a government, but Macron does, of course, do a dodgy deal with the so-called New Popular Front. Now, the New Popular Front's decision to go into an electoral pact with Macron for the second round is, in my view, a completely disastrous decision. The idea that this ultra-reactionary, pure puppet of the French ruling class, which is what Macron is, has no independent existence, not really. The idea that this creature that's just spent 5 years plus brutally attacking the French working class, the idea that he and his movement, which is, again, a synthetic creation put together by the French ruling class and their hired politicians, that this is something which is a bulwark against fascism, or that Macron represents in any way anything less fascist than Marine Le Pen, then that is a joke of a position, as I've said before. It's a joke of a position, and the NFP, unfortunately, is not a new version of the Popular Front, which the Popular Front in the 30s had a lot of problems anyway. But this is like literally the absolute definition of first time as tragedy, second time as farce. This is the farce. And the farce is when you see like the dumbos in the Social Democrats in this country, in the United States, screaming that the left has won the election. The left did not win the election. A very shaky grouping, the New Popular Front, managed to come out ahead just about. But it's riven with contradictions, and it's stuffed full of pro-imperialist politicians who are openly siding with fascism in places like Ukraine and in wider places in West Asia as well. So quite how this has any anti-fascist content, I'm not sure, unless, of course, we just reduce fascism to a question of manners and aesthetics, which is, of course, what the left does. So they did a deal with Macron, in my view, a completely unacceptable deal, one that delivers the left nothing. Of course, Macron was never going to make even somebody from the old Parti Socialiste prime minister. He wasn't going to make anybody prime minister who could be possibly influenced by some of the better elements in the NFP. He was going to find some way of appointing a technocrat in office. So which is what he's done with Barnier. Barnier, again, to recap his CV, long-time political operator, member of previous French cabinets, long-time European Union official, was the European Union official charged with being the EU's Brexit negotiator. So this guy's been given some big portfolios in the past. And again, he comes from the very old elite sections of the French governing class. And so he's been brought in to do a job for, well, the French ruling class. It would have been, the French ruling class will have basically told through their representatives Macron that he has to appoint Barnier. Now, Barnier is regarded as, according to the biographies in the various different articles I've read on him, like BBC, Politico, etc., the so-called mainstream sources. He's regarded as essentially as a troubleshooter, a man who can stabilize things, which is the big word I'm seeing used in a lot of the French bourgeois coverage, that they're looking for stability. Now, how is Barnier going to deliver stability when they're in a minority in the National Assembly, and they could be out if the left and the right vote together, they could deny Macron a government. But is Le Pen going to actually vote against Barnier? Now, Barnier is a shrewd man, apparently. He has that reputation. And so he has been positioning himself for a turn at power for quite some time now. He ran in the last presidential election. He talked when he ran in 2022, and he's continued to talk about this, about a moratorium on all immigration, and basically adopting certain elements of the Rassemblement National's plan. So this is the twist of fate and the inevitable twist of fate that the French left has now created for itself. They had an alliance in the second round of the parliamentary elections with Macron to keep out Le Pen. Now Barnier is looking to bring Le Pen really into the fold, more so than she is already, given that she has moved towards positions more acceptable to the French ruling class over the last few years. So Barnier is now looking to get at least the tacit consent of Rassemblement National. And to do that, he's been adopting various different elements that are much more from the RN Le Pen platform, especially on immigration, which is why Le Pen's immediate response to Barnier's selection by Macron was not negative, because she knows that he's already adopted or will adopt certain elements of her program, and she can drive a very hard bargain in terms of policy agenda. And all she has to do really is to not vote against him. So the advantage that RN has, Rassemblement National, over the NFP is that RN are a coherent grouping. They have 126 seats, all of which belong to their party. The NFP are a coalition of often ill-fitting forces, some of which would be very keen on Barnier. In fact, Hollande, whilst criticising Macron, the way Macron has appointed him, was praising Barnier's political qualities, because they know each other very well and would happily work together. So in backing Macron to get as many votes as he ultimately did, and trying to keep Le Pen out, as the NFP's tactics dictated, well, they're going to end up with, by the looks of it, a Barnier administration headed by a long-time technocrat, which is going to adopt large elements of the, shall we say, take large inspiration from the policies of Le Pen and turn them into the policies of Macron. And to do that, doing that for the specific purpose of slowly bringing Rassemblement National into the fold, which is what Barnier will be doing. I don't think they'll be in the cabinet at first. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But they will be offered an awful lot of inducements to at least stop them voting against the formation of the Barnier administration. And they'll be offered an awful lot of concessions. And as long as they, again, don't vote against him, knowing that they could pull the trigger on his government at any time will be enough to give Le Pen an enormous sway in these negotiations. And so the French left is going to end up with Le Pen's policies, but put in place by Barnier and Macron. So good job there, lads. Really great job. This, by the way, was what was always going to happen. Unless the NFP won almost total control of the National Assembly and were able to form a government themselves, there was no way that Macron was going to accept their nomination for Prime Minister. And even if had they won a much bigger number of seats, it would have been chaos trying to create a coherent cabinet out of these, what I would call the flotsam and jetsam of the petty bourgeois left in France. So this whole new Popular Front strategy is basically just crashing into the dirt now. And again, you're going to end up with Le Penism without Le Pen for now. So again, Barnier's job, I see it as getting a stable government in place, getting the agreement of Le Pen there to run an administration that is acceptable to her base. Whether she will go for it or not, I'm not sure. But her initial response has not been unfavourable. And the job that it will do, or it will seek to do, is to, of course, impose an even more vicious attack on the working class. It will do so, though, by counterbalancing this, as they would see it, by adopting the Le Pen platform when it comes to immigration in order to buy themselves some more legitimacy. That is what will happen. At the same time, they'll be attacking the working class. They'll be engaging in all kinds of anti-immigration shit, or at least on the performative level. Whether it turns into a real thing or not, I'm not sure. But at least in terms of rhetoric and in terms of policies they will pass through the assembly, they will be adopting more and more of the Le Pen line. So again, great job there by Mélenchon and the lads. And as I say, the ultimate aim is to bring Rassemblement National in-house, make sure they're brought into the tent to piss outwards, to quote Lyndon Johnson. And that's the idea. You bring them in and you essentially subordinate them to the priorities of the French ruling class, just as Meloni and her Brothers of Italy, I think it's called, party, has been subordinated to the Italian ruling class, just as Salvini and the Lega Nord were in Italy as well. And that's the ultimate aim with Le Pen. And Le Pen's already gone a long way towards giving them that. So the Rassemblement National are tomorrow's government. The Barnier administration is going to be, if it succeeds, a transitional form, which essentially paves the way for a RN government that will be moderated in the interests of the French ruling class by probably the presence of various establishment figures within any cabinet that is ultimately formed under an RN administration. So that's where we are. The French ruling class are looking to stabilize the situation by putting a technocrat in charge, hoping that they can play upon the divisions in the NFP, which are there, and that they can buy off the RN for now in order that they can get busy with their real work, which is trying to find a way to crush French working class resistance. And with that, I'm going to right, okay, we have problems. Don't know what the hell happened there. The visuals went down. I wasn't looking at the camera, so I wasn't aware of that. Hopefully the visuals have come back now. Let me know if there's any further problems. I don't know what happened with that one. Certainly not supposed to be that way. Okay, so I think we're back online now. Apologies for any drop off in video there. Don't know what happened with that. But yes, I will now go through comments, answer some questions, etc. So, greetings to Paul Mason. Paul, the invite to come on the show still stands. He says, this should be good. Nobody loves the egregious second coming of Bonaparte more than me. Well, taking inspiration for your work in the UK, Paul. Richard, hello. The time is now, by the way. Hello to you out there on Rumble. If you're watching on Rumble, you can comment in the chat there, and it will show up on the StreamYard service I'm using here. Nehat Mere says, that Macron guy looks like a product of N-tier nepotism. Yeah, he's bottom of the barrel stuff. And this is perhaps ironic coming from me, but I'm really satisfied to see that he's losing his hair. He's gone for the old monk cut now, Macron. So presumably the stress is getting to him. Hello to Robeson out in Indonesia. Good to have you with us. Hello to Jerry, who's just seen a video of Macron being hit with an egg. Yeah, the man is not popular. I mean, he's popular with the tiny, well, not tiny, but the minority that votes for him. But he's a loathed figure, and deservedly so. Tim Gray, good evening to you. Kent, hello to you. D.E., hello to you. James Graham, Z to you. Michael Morris says, Barmy Barnier, what could go wrong? Everything. Lee, good evening to you, comrade. More time needed is here, as is Ivan Kovac from the once and future Socialist Republic of Croatia. President Jesus has joined us, as has Peter from Perfidious Albion. We have also Sid Hatfield. We have Jenny Lynn joining us. Neander Wallace says, ex-Man United player Brian McClare was spotted wearing a James Connolly t-shirt. Well, Brian McClare always came across as a more intelligent man than some of his contemporaries. And perhaps his taste in political figures shows that. Guy joins us from Brazil. James Goblin says good evening, and the evening will be even better if you like and share the video. James's advice is solid. The Neander Wallace says the French engage in boss snapping, where they hold the bosses in their office until he agrees to their terms. Yeah, it's a militant form of struggle, most certainly. Generally, though, that was about payment, payment of wages sometimes, but it was often about payment of redundancy fees or redundancy terms. So militant, but also unfortunate, because it means essentially that the French workers have to start kidnapping people in order just to get the minimum out of the system, minimum in terms of redundancy payments. Muniz joins us, as does Owen, who says, will Europe break free of US imperial control? Not just yet, Owen. But the point you raise is a good one. This is why the position of the NFP on things like Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable, because until this is about two things. It would be inaccurate to say that the Europeans are straightforwardly and simply vassals of the United States. They are all smaller imperialist powers who have fallen in behind the leadership of the United States because they need US imperialism to back them up in order for them to cling on to the markets they control. At the same time, US imperialism is constantly trying to undermine them and steal those markets out from under them. This is the way it's always gone. So they are constantly complaining about the US, but they can't get away from the US. The US, of course, recreated all of these powers, rebirthed them, recreated capitalism within them after 1945. And they've never been able to really break free of the US since then, despite the fact that they still try to pursue their own interests. So it's a push and pull thing. Mainly the US gets what it wants, but it's inaccurate to say that Europe is simply straightforwardly controlled by US imperialism. They exercise a lot of power, but it's more to the fact that there is a shared interest there. There's a shared interest, as I said, in trying to destroy Russia. There's a shared interest, ultimately, in trying to destroy China, which is why they're going along with it. There's elements in the French and German ruling class who don't want to lose their opportunity of doing business with the Chinese, but there's a much bigger concern in that they don't want to lose markets to the more competitive Chinese exports. They don't want to lose their premier tech production positions to Chinese competition. And so therefore, they are increasingly going along with the US's plan, which is to try and collapse the Chinese government, try and remove the Communist Party of China from power. This isn't going to work, but because all of their systems are in a deep crisis, they're being pushed along to follow the US in the line of complete belligerence that it's pursuing, because they need the same thing the US needs. They need the collapse of Russia. They need the collapse of China. Let's go back to the French example to explore why. The events in West Africa, in the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, to a certain extent Chad and Guinea as well. As I said, this is the neo-colonial empire that was put together by de Gaulle in the late 50s and into the 60s. It enabled the French partially through the usage of the French franc, as it was, the CFA franc area, which was a currency they imposed upon Mali and places like that, which was controlled by the French, which essentially denied monetary sovereignty to these newly supposedly independent countries. That gave the French a stranglehold on what they could and couldn't do. Also, is one of the reasons why an awful lot of these countries' gold reserves was stored in the Bank of France. And the French dominated the key elements of their economies. So, uranium mining in Niger, gold mines in what was once called Upper Volta, now after the great Thomas Sankara changed the name, it's called Burkina Faso. And you've also got gold reserves in places like Mali. So all these places have valuable natural resources which remained under the control of French monopolists for a long time. Until recently, when the nationalist army officers started cooing out the compliant governments in these countries. And this, of course, started slightly before the special military operation in Ukraine. But the revelation of how weak the French, the British, the Germans, and ultimately the United States really were, this encouraged the resistance of the Sahel states. And for the French, that's a disaster. It's a disaster that's been, in their view, partially triggered by the fact that the Russians are involved in these areas, as are the Chinese as well. But the Russians have been doing a lot of the more overt political and military work there. And so they're really desperate for Russia to be destroyed because they identify the Russian presence in West Africa as being inimical to their interests. And the Chinese presence across Africa now, being China, I think now, is for most of the African nations, it's their number one trading partner. Not any of the old European powers, not the US. So this, the Chinese taught the language of cooperation, not competition, etc., mutual respect for each other's interests. But of course, imperialists don't talk that language. They never have, they never will. They taught the language of, securing mutual interest, that kind of thing. But imperialism must seek domination over everything else. And that's what they seek at all times. So to answer the point about Europe and US imperial control, Europe is compelled by the nature of their own imperialist interests to go along with the bigger imperial power in the form of the United States. Because the bigger prize here is not just the breaking up and the dismembering of Russia and the looting of its resources and its people, but also the elimination of those powers that are rising who are non-imperialist, which could threaten the stranglehold of the imperialist powers over what they regard as their neo-colonial possessions. So it's important to analyze this properly. Like, yes, there are elements in the French and German ruling class who object to not being able to do business in China anymore. But the much bigger prize is the drive by the US to try and resubordinate China and to destroy the government of led by the CPC. That's what they want. And the prize for the French bourgeois will be much bigger if the US gets what it wants. So it is in the interests of the French ruling class, and this is why they are led in this by the more far-sighted elements, to go along with the US in trying to destroy the Chinese government and the Russian governments. So it's their nature of the fact that the French, the Germans, are imperialist powers and cannot have so-called fair competition with the Chinese and the Russians. They have to have complete domination. And so that compels them to follow the US into more and more extreme situations. Palawan joins us from the South China Sea, the Philippines in particular. Greetings to you. Greetings to Dr. Ahmed. Sid joins us from... Is it Cincinnati you're joining us from, Sid? Do confirm if you are. Hello to Rusky Partisan and Jack Jones. And Otis is with us. Sid says, France has been a second-tier power run by second-tier political leaders for quite some time. Yes, that's quite true, and so is Britain. Harold joins us. A lot of people's comments are disappearing 5 seconds after they've been typed. Hang on. Let's see what's going on here. I think that Rumble is a bit freer. Uh, I'm not sure if that's always the case, but yeah, the live chat in Rumble is active. So if you're over there, that should be perhaps a little freer to use. Let's just check the YouTube chat to make sure that we're on the right settings there. If you'll all bear with me for just a moment, it should be on. Should be on the show all. If it's not, I will adjust it now. Right, okay. Right, so that's now on show all. It was only on top chat again. So if you're having problems contributing to the chat, then let me know. Also, still recruiting for moderators for this channel. I've had one volunteer so far. Email me or message me if you're looking to if you're interested in doing so. Neander Wallace says the US is just the largest shareholder in imperialism, so has a bigger voice in the shareholder meetings. That's a good way of putting it. Arnold joins us from sunny Bridlington. Good to have you with us. Hello, hi says, why didn't the CPG-BML support the Iranian uprising a while back? Because that uprising was backed by imperialism, for that simple reason. If that uprising had succeeded, it was specifically aimed at destroying the current Iranian system. And that, regardless of whatever cause started that revolt, it was appropriated and grabbed hold of very quickly by pro-imperialist and comprador elements in Iran. That's why we didn't support it. Tim Gray says, how can France escape its decline now that former French West African countries have booted them out? They can't, Tim. That's the thing. The French working class really should be told quite openly that the working class and peasantry of the Sahel region, of the Sahel countries, are their allies, because the more that the French imperialists are weakened, the more the French bourgeoisie at home are weakened. And the more they're weakened, the easier it will ultimately be for the French working class to revolt against them and haul them down from their palaces of the mighty, shall we say. Hello to Yu Wan out there in Phoenix, Arizona. Bart says, Burkina Faso means the land of upright men, very different than Europeans. Indeed, we should all aim to be a land of upright men and women, of course. But it's a great name for a country. Sid Hatfield is correct, which is right now is definitely not the time to be talking about fake revolutions. That's not Sid's term, that's mine. In an openly anti-imperialist country like Iran. Iran plays a progressive role in the region, and is one of the chief elements that are resisting U.S. imperialism and their Israeli puppet state. So, no, we're not supporting so-called uprisings sponsored by the U.S. in Iran. Don't be silly. What about people who say Russia is an imperialist country? Asked Alex Oliveira. Then there's various sources that you can direct them to, but I will list some of them, and we listed some of them before on the Telegram channel, but we're going to do that again. Look, the biggest there's two big things that we should hit upon here. First of all, Russia is an exporter of commodities and not capital. Second of all, the Russians, far from being an aggressive expansionist imperial power, have spent 8 years desperately trying to find the negotiated settlement. Russia might be a capitalist country now, indeed it is, but it's a non-imperialist country, and there's a whole long list of articles I will post up as to why that is. So if you want more info on that, I'll post more on the Telegram group. But the biggest thing is that the Russian capitalist class is still a weak and feeble creation. They haven't not reached the stage where they're even at the export of capital phase that the Russian bourgeois were in like 1914. They survive because essentially they are in a situation where they've bargained for the safety of their profits with a relatively progressive Bonapartist system headed by Putin. So, like the biggest place that Russian capital is exported to is not exploited developing world countries. It's Cyprus. Why does Russian capital go to Cyprus? Is there a Russian empire operating in Cyprus? No. It's where the bank accounts of the oligarchs are. That's where Russian capital export went to until, of course, the US closed that down. So the idea of Russia being an imperialist power doesn't stand up to the slightest examination. You are in Cincinnati indeed. Hello to Sid out there in Cincinnati. Never been there myself. Hope to go there someday. Owen Sanders says, will there be a point at which US, Europe abandon their Xeno-Russia campaign, change operation and Russia regime change operation and seek compromise with multipolarity? No. Not under the current system. The current system and the current ruling class cannot survive without being imperialists. That's how they've operated for hundreds of years. It's how their system is set up to operate. They can't. The Russians and the Chinese say, "Well, let's have international cooperation. Let's have, true a more democratic multipolar system." The imperialists cannot allow that. In fact, this is an excellent question to pick up on in a future live stream. So I'm going to note it down and I'm going to come back to it because there's a lot to be said about that. I'm just going to put that up on the screen there. So Owen, note your question down. I'll be addressing it next week. Jenny's right. Rumble is much better. I mean, I tried using the Rumble Studio system earlier today and it was shite, but it doesn't censor as much. However, I hear that the DOJ in the United States is now after arresting the CEO of Rumble. So this is what happens with free speech platforms. Like, the ruling class is okay with free speech as long as it doesn't matter, as long as nobody's listening. With the Israel thing, people are starting to listen, and that cannot be allowed. That, and of course, Rumble's been caught up in the middle of this bitch fight of an election in the United States, where like the Biden administration is trying to weaponize the justice system against their political rivals, which is what they've been doing for years. Trump tried it too, by the way. So, as the great investigative journalist Whitney Webb has correctly pointed out, the Trump is no better when it comes to all of these censorship elements than Biden is. Again, they're all serving fundamentally the same master. Jenny, you're offering to mod. Email me if you're interested in this. I'm going to post up the email address of the website. So yeah, post that up. Email me if you want to take up modding. Yeah, it'd be good to have a sort of slightly better moderated chat. And if you've followed me for a while, you know that my general policy is not to delete comments unless somebody is particularly obnoxious or spamming. President Jesus said, would Alex consider sporting a beanie and dropping the British accent for $400,000 a video, asking for a shady friend? Where is my running hat? Hang on. Hey, look, make it $1,000, and we may have a deal. Is that how much that they're alleging Tim Pool got from RT, or something? I mean, fuck me, I've been on RT about 20 fucking times and never paid me a single pound. Yeah, how come Dumbo right-wing Americans get all the money? Actually, I just answered my question. Ruski Partizan says, liberation of North Africa from the French is the most hopeful thing for the world that the special military operation has contributed to exposing imperialism. These people deserve a bright future. Their leaders inspire. That's true. In the end, I mean, the war in Ukraine devastating though it is one part of this sort of moving this moving picture that is the evolution of the next evolution of the struggle against colonialism, which had its initial bursts after World War II, ran out of steam and got subordinated slightly, but they couldn't completely undo the independence of these countries. Now there will be a new impetus, and there already is a new impetus in the freedom struggle. So that's going to affect everywhere. That's dominated by the French, the British, the Germans, everywhere where the imperialists are present. Everywhere there is misery, there will be more revolts now. Starting off with more sort of typically nationalistic revolts, but inevitably going towards more radical territory that people like Traore occupy. Hello, hi, says US communists shouldn't use the US flag. It is the flag of imperialism and colonialism. Well, that's up to US communists. I'm sure that there are plenty in the chat who would disagree with that. Again, I've made my position clear on the old butcher's apron. I really don't think that that's something that we in Britain can use, precisely because it was adopted as a flag not during a high period of revolution. It wasn't a revolutionary symbol, never has been. It's always been a symbol of the bourgeois in terms of their ending of the revolution. Now, there are revolutionary flags in this country, and we've got a few of them ourselves in our supply here in the Northwest. The flags of the Revolutionary New Model Army, for instance, which is a red flag, interestingly enough. That's a revolutionary symbol. There are other revolutionary symbols which could be adopted as a new flag of the country. And that's what we will probably need to do. The butcher's apron, though, no, we can't use that. Again, that is purely a symbol of the bourgeois. It's a symbol of the bourgeois from their high imperialist period. It's a symbol that has flown over the looting and destruction of the country right next door to us in the form of the Irish, of places like India. So it's not something that we can use. Even in its very earliest origins, it was a flag of reaction. Now, there's an argument to be made about what the Stars and Stripes represents because it comes out of a revolutionary period. But again, that's a debate for the Americans to have. I will defer to their decision. Neander Wallace says, like a wild animal, imperialism will fight more fiercely to the closer to its death it is. Interesting times. Indeed, and interesting times means difficult, dangerous, but always filled with opportunity. Owen, hope I answered your question. Jenny says, I found a few words, rumble sensors. The same word is banned here too. I can't say it. Lol. Okay, don't know what. Email me the word. I want to know it now. What about the Trotskyist revolution of Iraq and Syria? If you know, you know. Well, you're going to have to speak in something other than riddles there, mate. Be clear about what you're saying. Sid Hatfield says, the state seems to ready to crack down openly on anyone who disputes the overall narrative. This has been happening for years. I mean, go back 20 years. Some of you may have been around back then. This was going on 20 years ago. It's got more aggressive as time's gone on, but like this was starting to happen in the so-called War on Terror period. Back then, of course, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was message boards. That's how long ago this was. But as soon as like the internet started to be a problem for them, they started talking about censoring it. As soon as it became their ability to control the message became compromised, they started talking about locking up anybody who disagreed with them. As soon as it became obvious that their institutions were being drained of legitimacy, they started talking more and more about, you know, calling anybody who disagreed with the current ruling class a terrorist and throwing them in prison. Again, this is an old game, but this again it actually goes back even further to like the period after the 1960s, which is where they started tightening up every single year various different laws, calling it anti-terrorism, anti-crime, anti-drug. The overall objective, though, was always the same, which is to use lawfare, as it's called now, against your political opponents, against anybody who gets in the way. I mean, they did this with the trade union movement. With the collaboration of the trade union leaders, now they put it into, and this is the way they prefer to do things, rather than banning something. They prefer to put you in a legal framework where you're fined to death or face prison if you step out of that legal framework. But if you, like the trade union leaders do, go along with the ruling class and cooperate with them and collaborate with them to squash workers' movements and to keep workers divided, then you'll end up with a place in the House of Lords. That's the way the British prefer to do things, rather than banning things outright. As time goes on and they get more desperate, though, they'll just start banning things and just be throwing people in prison like they did with Assange. That's what they're going to do. Are there any of my programs on Rumble that aren't on YouTube? Not at the moment. We may vary that up in the near future. If YouTube censorship gets particularly bad, we may need to investigate other platforms. Indeed, Sea of Kronos, Whitney Webb's work is excellent. I'm looking to get an interview with her at some point soon, I hope. The Rumble app is banned in Denmark, says Kawabi, but I can at least use it on the browser. Interesting. Yeah, so far it's not banned in Britain. We'll have to see. DE says perhaps we could do a Britain, Europe communist bus tour of the USA. We might have to pretend to be a bluegrass band or something to get around. Well, I can play the trumpet and the bass guitar, so I've got two one-man band elements right there. So declare ourselves to be a Celtic folk group. There we go. I'll stick the old family tartan on and we'll go out on tour. VV asks, what do you mean by imperialists exporting capital? Are they seeking to invest in subordinate countries? Imperialists export capital. This is how it is described by Lenin in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Imperialists start exporting capital rather than commodities after around about the 1860s, because you can get a much higher rate of profit by investing in other countries other than your own, by finding hyper-exploitable sources of labor and resources, which you can't readily find back at home because the price of labor of the working class has got too high. That's a very short way of describing what it is. So if you look at the US, which exports $1 trillion of capital to Britain and Europe every year, that's money they're moving into and through various different stock markets, wealth funds, various different businesses. That with that capital, they're looking to get returns from various different places. And with Britain as well, you look at Britain exports a gigantic amount of capital to areas of the world that the British used to directly colonize. So yes, they're looking to gain a higher profit by investing in, as you put it, subordinated countries. We can do a much greater exposition on that at length in the near future. Censorship is a form of desperation, says Ruski Partisan. That's true. In Sweden, also says Ruski Partisan, 18 to 23-year-olds had voted left for 30 years. In 2022, the right and the Sweden Democrats were the largest parties. This trend in the US with Trump, censorship increases cynicism. It favors the right. Various different generations for 30 years voting left. Basically, they voted left in Sweden for many years. and it only produced worse results. Same thing happens everywhere. People voted for like left parties thinking that they were voting for social democracy, and they did basically the same things that the right would do. And people then got cynical and voted for whatever demagogue comes along and makes some points about the left which are true, then just does a whole bunch of bullshit when he gets into power. Like, censorship must be opposed. We cannot give the capitalists tools to use against us. So I even would oppose like the censorship of people like the actor Stephen Yaxley Lennon and the EDL. Like the ruling class uses them to justify censorship, but I oppose the censorship of them as well. Even though they are politically revolting, they are still just tools of the ruling class. Opinions on Maoists in Afghanistan. Opinion on the Maoists in Afghanistan in the 80s was that they were taking the reactionary line of Maoists in general in that period to its extreme conclusion, which is siding with the imperialists. Are you worried as an anti-establishment content creator? Asks Owen. At the moment, no. I mean, they might choose to snuff out the channel. I mean, I'm pretty much convinced that the YouTube shadow bans or suppresses it somehow. I mean, I'm not worried about them shutting it down as of yet, because I mean, you look at the people that they go after in terms of YouTubers, etc. It's people with a big audience, and I'm under no illusions that this is a relatively small audience, which I of course value. But were I to get like Richard Medhurst numbers, yeah, then it would be a problem. Then you would get the knock on the door from the government, basically. That's how this works. If you remain in a ghetto, talking to only a small number of people, doesn't matter whether it's online or in person. If you're given a meeting about Marxism and like there's 5 people there, and you're talking about revolution, the ruling class don't care about that. They might send one spy in. Maybe they wouldn't even do that. But if you start getting, 100 people there, 200 people there, if the influence of Marxism starts spreading through the working class in a bigger way, then the state acts. This is the way that they do things. They prefer to isolate you, keep you in a ghetto, and a sort of ideological ghetto. As long as Marxism remains an intellectual pursuit only, then you can be a Marxist. If Marxism, Leninism starts to make serious inroads into the British working class and starts to cause problems for the ruling class in doing so, because suddenly thousands and thousands of workers become class conscious who weren't before, then that's their problem. That's when they will come down on you like a ton of bricks. And they will work actively with their collaborators in the trade union movement and elsewhere to stop that happening. So we should always be clear about the limitations here. We will use the bourgeois democratic freedoms as long as they exist, and we will defend them as much as we can in order to use them to get our message across. But when the ruling class get desperate, they'll pull the rug on us. We should be under absolutely no illusions about that. What legal advising says, I would like to know what you think about the relationship between imperialism and terrorism. Whole show coming up on that, I think. It will probably need to be. Okay, so we're recruiting let's just call it a joint, a multicultural folk band if we're going to go on tour with this. Hello Hi says, apparently Israel is arming gangs in Gaza to cause chaos. Well, they had some organized crime elements on their side in Gaza like 20 years ago. So I mean, hiring lumpens to go after a national liberation movement wouldn't be the first time. I mean, US has done that. The British have done that before. Tim Gray says, I'm not sure the petty bourgeois in Britain are aware of what is coming down the line, as the ruling class looks to hollow out what is left of the post-1945 state. They're not aware of it. Well, some are. There's more now that are, But the great bulk of them think that it's just push and pull and that somehow things will reform themselves again. I think most people are still not aware that this is a downward spiral that doesn't, from which there is not going to be a comeback. Like, the period of reform is not just gone, it is never returning. People still can't accept that at the moment. A larger number do, but we're in a minority. Tim Musky Patterson says what they do is that Trump and Le Pen is perceived as being punk to them, like being anti-Thatcher in the 80s. Tim Pool is a reaction against censorship. Yeah, I mean, Tim Pool lives off vibes and attitude. You're right about that. Okay, so I'm going to have to draw things to a close for this evening. I'll be back tomorrow, possibly later, because I'm on the road for a little bit tomorrow. Not band practice, but something else. But we'll be doing a live later on that day. So thanks to all 271 of you who are watching. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Links in the description box below to both of those. I will be back with you again tomorrow. But until then, good night and solidarity.